Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is November the 16th. It's the week after the climate summit, the COP26 in Glasgow. And also it's a week after our webinar, the Green Belt and Road, which we held here in Stockholm. And we had a fantastic group of international experts, former officials, from many countries who discussed for almost the whole day in 2 sessions the question of greening the Belt and Road Initiative and what is China's policies, what are the other issues related to that. So I encourage everybody to go to our YouTube channel and watch the whole proceedings and the discussion which followed. Today we have one of the guests from the webinar, Mr. Henry Tillman. He's the founder and chairman of the China Investment Research, who made a very fantastic presentation, which we would like him to elaborate a bit more today, because it's relevant to what we are intending to discuss. Welcome, Henry.
Welcome, thank you.
You're welcome. You got very good reactions to your presentation, and that's why we thought the people who did not attend the webinar should be able to see it again, but in more detail. Now, what I want to start with is the whole discussion about the COP26 in Glasgow, which was practically a failure in a sense. Many people are admitting that. The problem is that the Western countries, Europe and the United States especially, and Japan, the reason they did not manage to get everyone on board is that they are oblivious to the aspirations of economic development and eradication of poverty of the developing sector. Therefore, they did not get the response they wanted from these countries. First of all, the Chinese president did not attend. He didn't even make an online speech. He just sent a statement read by an official. President Vladimir Putin of Russia did not attend. The president of Turkey did not. He changed his mind in the last minute. But there were also protests from both India and also many African leaders and Latin American leaders, because they saw that the West is intending to solve the problem, as we say, in a negative way by stopping progress, stopping industrialization and economic development. Those nations were saying, look, you have been industrial nations for 200 years. We are just beginning on this path. And therefore, we should have a chance for development in line with this question of emission reduction and climate mitigation. So the thing which we want to discuss actually is, first of all, the international community has an obligation to fulfill what the nations of the world agreed to implement, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030. As I discussed in my presentation in the webinar, which you can review, is that there's enormous difference in what are the priorities, but the priorities are very clear in the UN SDGs 2030s, that first, eliminating poverty, second, eliminating hunger, 3, providing electricity and clean water and education and healthcare and infrastructure, industrialization, urban development. All these things are the priorities of the developing nations. In number 11 and 13 come the question of climate action. But the Western countries have put climate action and environmental protection in the beginning of the whole list of priorities, forgetting about that nations in Africa, and that we have 600 million people in Africa who don't even have electricity, access to electricity. As many and even more don't have access to clean water. So it's in this light that there is enormous resistance to these kinds of summits on climate. Now, what I want to discuss is this different, because it's very important that people understand what the Chinese mean by their green transition. It's not the same. When the Chinese say sustainable development, they mean something different than we understand in the West. Because in China and Asia and Africa, when people say sustainable development, they say sustainable development. They put emphasis on development. In the West, we say sustainable development. we put emphasis on the sustainability of development, which we think is in doubt, that development is not really sustainable. Now, also the way to deal with these problems, whether environmental, climate, and other, we have a negative way here in the West by shutting down coal power, shutting down industries, stopping to eat meat, stop this, stop that, put high taxes on fuel and cars. This is a negative way of dealing with it. What the Chinese in Asia, in Africa want to do, they want to do it positively, which makes it completely different, because they want to develop economically, but they say we deal with the problems of pollution and climate problems through investment in modern technology, going forward, not going backward. And that's where the big misunderstandings come up. People say, the Chinese say, we want to have a green transition, but they're building coal power plants. How come? And they think China is tricking everybody in this sense. Now, we have a number of documents to explain the Chinese vision and policy. We got a number of documents and speeches also by President Xi Jinping to explain what the Chinese mean by green transition. And it's very, very important for people to understand these things because they think the Chinese are playing a game. And people are not allowed to open the door or the window and look at what the Chinese are doing at home, how they are thinking, what is their policy. So I'm not going to go through this, of course, but I will take some quotes from both speeches by President Xi Jinping, which he made recently, and also very important documents issued by Chinese government agencies. And then in the coming days, we will have a full review of all these things, which will be published. President Xi Jinping, not in the climate summit, he made two interesting speeches, one at the G20 summit in Rome and one at the ASEAN summit last week. So in the speech at the G20 summit on October 30, President Xi Jinping said, sustainable development is facing unprecedented challenges. In this context, we must take a people-centered approach and make global development more equitable, effective, inclusive, and that no country will be left behind. He continues, says, the G20 should prioritize development in macro policy coordination, ensure sound implementation of the action plan on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, move forward with the initiative on supporting industrialization in Africa. That's controversial. And least developed countries. That's industrialization in Africa and least developed countries. And promote synergy among the existing mechanisms for development cooperation. Advanced economies should fulfill their pledge on official development assistance. Then he says infrastructure development plays an important role in propelling economic growth. China has made unremitting efforts in this regard through the Belt and Road Initiative and cooperation and other initiatives. China is prepared to work with all sides to uphold the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefit. Stay committed to the vision of open, green, and clean cooperation and pursue the goal of high standard, people-centered, and sustainable development, so as to deliver more fruitful outcomes from high-quality Belt and Road cooperation. Then in his speech at the Asia-Pacific, the ASEAN summit, but the CEO summit, not the summit of the leaders, because that speech is, I think it was more interesting. He said more interesting things pertaining to the question I'm trying to take up. He said, in the Asia Pacific, over 100 million people still live in abject poverty. Some economies are still plagued by inadequate infrastructure development, education, and healthcare, and they are weak in food security and energy supply. Without development, it will be impossible to pool the economic strength necessary for achieving green transition. Neglecting people's livelihood means loss of social support for pursuing green transition. We need to gain an accurate understanding of what sustainable development means. Put the people first and strike a balance between economic growth, ensuring people's well-being, and energy conservation and emissions reduction. This will enable us to catalyze green transition in the course of economic development and achieve greater development through green transition. People first, development first. Then we will have the means to do the green transition. Now, one document we are reviewing now is called the Action Plan for Carbon Dioxide Peaking Before 2030, how to peak the carbon dioxide emissions. And this is this was issued by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. In one of the points, it says, working in a steady and orderly manner to safely reduce carbon emissions. It says, based on China's energy resource conditions of rich in coal but poor in oil and gas, we must insist construction before destruction, stabilize energy stock, and expand energy increment. We must keep national energy security and economic development as the bottom line. Strive for time to realize the gradual replacement of new energy and promote the smooth transition of energy low carbon transformation. We will take concrete steps to safeguard China's energy security, food security, and security of industrial and supply chains, and to keep ordinary citizens living and working as normal. There is a whole section on nuclear power actually in this, how the Chinese leadership is thinking about this, the peaking of carbon dioxide and the transition. And there's a whole section on the different technologies they're going to invest in, new generations of nuclear power, but also the small modular reactors and other types, which Henry is going to talk about when it comes to the transport sector, and also on fusion energy development. So there is also another document. It's called Working Guidance for Carbon Dioxide Peaking and Carbon Neutrality in Full and Faithful Implementation of the New Development Philosophy. It's issued by the Department of Resources Conservation and Environmental Protection and published by the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC. I'm not going to go through the quotes here because it's similar, but there's enormous emphasis on the priority on economic development and safeguarding China's energy security, food security, industrial capabilities, and so on and so forth. But the idea is to think forward. They also talk about how China is planning to mitigate the climate and carbon dioxide emissions by massive forestation, with the so-called carbon sink. Which China is the leader in the world in forestation to absorb so-called the carbon dioxide. So there we're going to review all these things, and therefore we're going to now go back to our guest. Sorry for keeping you waiting. I thought these points were important to share with our viewers, but I think, Henry, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, you focused on the greening of the Belt and Road in terms of how the transport sector will look like and what China and other partners of China are thinking in terms of this transition to new fuels, new technologies. So please, Henry, can you take us on your tour and let our viewers see in more detail what you presented at the webinar last week?
Sure. Thank you very much for the background and certainly for the intro. Maybe before I go to the slides, I'll make a couple of points. One is that this document has been designed to take a look around at a time of 2030 as a point. These are the developments leading up to 2030, but assume that most of these will be fully functional by 2030, but headed in that direction already, number one. Number two is it actually focuses on 3 of the countries that didn't turn up at COP26. So instead of talking about it, among 20,000 people. These are three countries, meaning China, Russia, and Turkey, that are already doing it. They're already on the tracks to get these things done by a period of around 2030. So these are practical things happening already with a goal of being fully functional by 2030. Yes, for background purposes. You share slides here? Yeah. Just a second. Slideshow animation. Right, this should work, Hussein. Right, this is, so as I said, there are three components. The first is Arctic liquid natural gas, or LNG. The second deals with electric high-speed rail, the HSR, which you'll see throughout the document. That's both across Eurasia and now starting to become functional in Southeast Asia, although by 23 to 26, this will be more than just what you see today, but developing very quickly. This will probably be much faster in terms of high-speed rail through Southeast Asia and into Kunming into the west than it actually is through across Eurasia for lots of reasons related to border crossings. And the last I just want to talk about is molten salt reactors. And I only talk about those with respect to container shipping and or icebreakers. I do not go into all the detail that Hussein's talking about, but this alone will make a huge difference in CO2 emissions. And again, the timetable is by 2030, before actually 2030. So those are the three areas I want to focus on. They are around improvements in transportation. So the first of these deals with Arctic liquid natural gas. I presented originally on the paper the launch of the Polar Silk Road in 2018. In 2019, I presented a map which was very different from this. The map that I presented in 2019 at the Arctic Circle had Norway had a lot more activity in the west through Kirkenes, or rail through Norway, rail into the Baltics. Yes, and much more flow from the west into the west rather than to the east. And you'll see what has happened since 2019, which is the flow has the much more activity towards the east and the south over time. So what has not happened is movement westward, and what has happened is both movement eastward and all to the south. So when we first talked about this in 2019, it had 4 or 5 countries, and now you see 7. And just to walk you through the timetable here, the first investor in this was Japan. Was in 2009. This was launched around 2002, 2004. Japan was first in 2009. France was next in 2011. China was next to come in 2014, not surprisingly, following the sanctions the US launched on Russia at the time. Korea followed in 2015 with ships, Japan in 2019 with investment, and we've seen in 2021 both India discussing increased use of Arctic LNG and also the entrance of the UAE. Now this entire area, which is led by Russia, since Russia has 60% of the Arctic's population lives inside Russia, and 1/3 of the landmass of the Arctic side of this page are forecast for 2017, 2018, 2019, where we were forecasting that by the middle of 2023, we might be at 50 million tons per year. And to give you some reference point, that was up from 16 million tons of LNG production from 5 years before, but still well below the world leaders. On the right-hand side now, you see both the existing and under construction could approximate almost 80 million tons a year by 2024, 2025, which is the same level as Qatar, a world leader. So in essence, Russia has accelerated this production level to the point where they could become one of the world leaders by 2024, 2025. And why is that important? We go to the next couple of slides. The first piece is being driven by cost. You see below the line below where Yamal's marginal cost to Europe is much lower than the rest of these. So by cost alone, Russia can produce this and ship it at a much lower pricing to Eastern Japan, Korea, China, and now India, then the West can do it. So you see the huge pricing difference. By the way, this slide came out of the Novacek annual quarterly reports. So you can find it among Novacek finds in quarterlies. But if you, again, the key is the pricing is much lower. So the combination of the supply, the great supply, and
is the pricing or the cost of production?
it's cost of production and cost of transportation, both.
Okay.
Because if you will, it's a good question. If you go back to this slide, it's actually produced in Russia and shipped around the top to a Kamchatka, yes, and then delivered from Kamchatka down. So it's both produced at the top of Russia, shipped around Russia, yes, in secure shipping, yes, and therefore, and I'll show you in a few minutes how it's much less shipping time involved with other countries. So both supply, secure shipping, local supply, and lower cost, then leads to a greater demand. So this is a demand expected to grow from the Arctic liquid natural gas demand over the next 20 years. Yes, and you see most of that is going to go to Asia Pacific. So the incremental demand will go to both to Asia and Europe, with the leaders being China, which will be the world leader, and India, which I'll show you in a few minutes, following it. Yes, to power those economies. And why liquid natural gas? The answer is it's much less carbon dioxide, much less CO2 emissions on LNG. So this is a transitional fuel. The EU may take issue with that, but it certainly will play an important role between 2015, 2020, and say 2035 and 2040. And just as you talked about the importance of this all being built into Chinese planning, in 2021 was for the first time the liquid natural gas has been embedded into how Russia will manage its country over the next 20 years. Yes, so both countries have embedded these future plans, long-term future plans, into the way their countries are going to be run. That shows you the increased needs and use in Asia and Europe over the next 20 years.
Yeah. Actually, in one of the policy papers I mentioned, the Chinese side is talking about using liquefied natural gas in ships as fuel for ships.
As well. And we come on to that a little bit later as we look at shipping. That's correct. On the right-hand side, we can't show you all the slides because we don't have the time. But this just shows you cargo volume for the northern route, shipping route. Yes, NSR. And you can see how it's changed so much over the past few years, and how it's been dominated by liquid natural gas shipping. Yes, as the ice melts. Again, we can't go through all these ice melting slides today, but it does show you dramatic uses or dramatic shifts, if you will, in shipping liquid natural gas, and how that's being a core part of that development. Here it is again in a different picture. Again, this is out of Novacek. So Murmansk on the left, Kamchatka on the right, and then of course the Yamal and Arctic LNG in the center, basically. There have been developments this year, both Murmansk and Kamchatka, both on the ground and also floating offshore LNG, where you could add more and more floating places offshore to continue to grow, if you will, shipping capabilities in those areas. You see the phase one is, and Murmansk is 2022. You see phase one of the others is 2022 as well, with growth further out. And then you look at the bottom, we can't really go again through all of the icebreakers, but it's fair to say that for now, Russia has 5 icebreakers currently that could, nuclear icebreakers that could, operational, that could break 2.3 meters of ice, and they're building icebreakers, 5 more icebreakers, which could break 4 meters of ice. So in other words, working year round through that northern shipping route. Yes, and you can see that how that's. China has also just decided to build one of these, as was announced in the last couple of weeks. There's no reason to read all the left-hand side. There's too much noise. On the right-hand side, I just point you to the bullet points. The first is that there has been some relationship historically in space between Russia and India. And then that's evolved to the point where in September this year, India was in discussions to buy a stake in Arctic LNG to join the other countries we talked about before. And you could see the natural gas to India as primary energy consumption, how it's nearly doubled. It was planning to be 15% in 2030, and now it's 25% of its future by 2030. I could also maybe take one step to go backwards on the investments in LNG. It's a 21 billion, LNG 2 is 21 billion, half of which is debt, half of which is equity. The debt became much more difficult to get this year as the EU requested strongly European banks do not get involved in this. And so Russia was clever enough to restructure one of those LNG functions to become ammonia related, permitting therefore Japan to invest in it, to also plug the gap, if you will, on the equity side. So it's the EU is not making this easy, although interestingly, we talk about here, Vladivostok and container shipping, how UAE is now one of the world's leaders, obviously, in DP world, in making container shipping, building a logistics hub in Vladivostok, linking it to rail, which we'll talk about in a second. But also in the east coast of Russia, we've already seen this year a smart port. The smart port was built by technology from Maersk, a EU company, and also by IBM, a US company. So it is attracting investment from other countries in the world to make this work. And I just highlight UAE here because UAE, because DP World is in fact one of the world's leaders in this.
That's the Dubai Ports world.
This is Dubai Ports. Yes, I think it's the largest company in the UAE in terms of market cap.
Yes,
and one of the early members of the BRI. So you can see how it's again moving farther east and farther south with India and the UAE, and attracting more and more attention and investment. And again, this is much cleaner. It's not perfect. It's much cleaner than, from a CO2 emissions point of view, than fuel oil and shipping. So that's the first component of it. And it is, and I see no reason at all why Novichok can't get to 80 million a year. And I think based upon Qatar now hiring China to build 4 more LNG ships, worried about their market leadership, Russia continues to take market share away from Qatar and other countries, and it will make it more and more difficult for the West to compete on a pricing and timing basis. Next, we move into rail. We start with Eurasian rail. On the left-hand side, you see the carriage crossings, the rail crossings from Eurasia from China into Europe. In 2011, numbered 17.
That's the number of trains, or
number of trains.
Okay.
In 2011, 17, and through the first 6 months of this year, they're on a 15,000 run rate. 15,000 run rate of trains. It is likely that the Shenyang and Urumqi can cap out at around 20,000 trains, just out of that one area alone. So you can see the huge progress made. In particular, look at the leaps during COVID, from 8,000 to 12,000, from 12 to 15, and now has added to 20,000, to the point where it actually has shut down. It choked itself down with too much flow in August of this year. Plus, there were COVID issues in the middle of in some of these countries. But you can see the amount of increase over time. I might also add, forecast-wise, rail versus shipping was around 1% market share in 2011. It's now an estimated 8% market share and growing.
Yes. We had a special podcast on this rail connection between China and Europe. The viewers can see it in the archived in our YouTube channel.
Yes, well, then we talk about, so here's another interim step. And the interim step is, you see the old TSR, the Trans-Siberian Railway in purple across the top. Well, that's 10,000 kilometers in 15 to 20 days. That's what we all talked about when we first started talking about this effort in 2013, 14, and 15. You now see a middle route. The middle route goes through Kazakhstan, Horgos, but instead of going north into Moscow and down, it then goes through what is known as BTK, Baku, Tbilisi, and Ankara, or to Turkey. Yes, it goes through Turkey at the lower end and straight into Slovakia, Romania, and others in the center. That's 7,000 kilometers in 10 to 15 days. And in this route, there is very little high-speed rail at this point. There's high-speed rail. There's some the BTK, again, Baku, Tbilisi, and into Turkey is between 120, 140 kilometers per hour, but it doesn't have the big high speed that we're talking about. These are the only
inside Turkey there is, of course, inside Turkey
there is. But that then leads us to the next slide, which is the future. So again, we talk about 2030. So let's stay in Eurasia first. So right now, from Moscow into Warsaw and south into Prague, Russia is building rail cars that go at 400 kilometers per hour, and you could stack two on top of each flat car. So that's headed towards a higher speed. You know, of course, the high-speed rail between Serbia and Hungary we've been talking about. Yes. And you also know there's some high-speed rail in Greece linking Athens to Thessalonica. But the piece that is missing that could really shorten it is what I show at the bottom here, is the M1 through Pakistan, which is now funded and now fully being rebuilt with a launch date of 2026, and which will actually go, we believe, will go through Tehran. So ultimately, it'll be Pakistan, it'll be Kashgar, Pakistan, Tehran, Greece, so Turkey, Greece, and up. Yeah. And this would be a fraction of the currently 10 to 12 days that we're talking about. Yes, and some of these, I think the number is, I think it's 160 kilometers currently on the M1 they're talking about by 2026. Yeah. And the numbers in Tehran are higher, across Iran are even higher.
Right, there's a lot of activity going on in the Gulf region, which I'm aware of. I'm involved in some discussions there. I think there's the Emirates have developed a line now which goes from Dubai to Bandar Abbas in Iran, and then overland through Tehran to Turkey. Also, because the fuel price in Iran is very low. I mean, the cost is Iran is giving lots of incentives, but also to connect the Pakistani ports of Karachi and the Gwadar to a port which is now, there's a big conflict around it in southern Iraq, in the Fao Peninsula, to connect Gwadar to Iraq, and then from Iraq to Turkey and the Mediterranean through Syria. There's a big discussion going on in Iraq, which I'm well aware of, and I'm involved in it. That Iraq also should become one of those nodes, the hubs, which will connect both the maritime and the land Silk Road. Anyways, well, the thing is, our discussion is about climate issues, fuel. Why do you think this is important?
Electric. It's all electric, and it's burning less because it's a lot faster. So if you look, and I want to make the point, when the first BRI forum was held in 2017, on one side of President Xi was President Putin. On the other side of President Xi was President Erdogan. And what you see here is two of these routes go through Turkey. Yes. And one of these routes go through Moscow. Yes. And the most important route goes to Moscow. So it's a precursor of what we saw years ago actually happening. But before I move to the next slide, I'd like to at least flag what's happening in Southeast Asia. Because as China develops in the West, as you well know, you look at how Kunming becomes really, really important. The rail, the normal rail from Myanmar into China is functional. Normal rail from Vietnam into China, Kunming, is now functional. You know, we talked about this at the actual webinar where the Laotian high-speed rail becomes functional next month. The Indonesian high-speed rail becomes functional next month. And we talk about from Laos to Bangkok, actually Kunming to Bangkok from 2023. So it's possible and certainly likely by 2030, this entire area in Southeast Asia from Kunming down is all high-speed rail and electric.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, and therefore electric meaning less usage. So that's that. Now we go into the third piece, which I know you've been wanting to talk about for some time. So let's go about this. So what I found this to be really, really interesting the more I get into it, because basically the whole concept of, we all know the issue, the container shipping industry is a leading source of global CO2 emissions. Just a couple of facts there on that. Number one, my understanding is if the container shipping were a country, it would be the 6th largest producing country of CO2 in the world. Number one. Number two is the one company, Maersk, uses 1 day's energy supply of the world. One company. Yes, extraordinary. So basically, it's an issue. The IMO was and the EU basically said you've got to cut emissions. It's been going quite slowly in the last couple of years. The EU is trying to force the issue. So they've been looking at other options. LNG, as you talked about a few minutes ago, about shipping using LNG, hydrogen, and I would say methane is it's actually green. It's really green. It's really green biofuels, basically, that Maersk is looking at, rather than methane. But what they're looking at actually is molten salt reactor, which we talk about here. It's quite an old technology. So basically, the U.S. has been using nuclear technology in its submarines since 1955, and the U.S. actually built a molten salt reactor in Tennessee in 1969. But it never took, the use never took off. There was one use in a container ship for about 8 years because you can't weaponize it. You can't weaponize thorium. This doesn't require uranium or plutonium. It uses thorium. Yes, non-explosive, really. So you can't, shortly after Japan went through what it had to go through with this nuclear issue, China had been working with Japan since 2011 to look at thorium as a power source. And it was just announced before I first raised this at the Arctic Circle Forum. They began first in that first thorium reactor in September 21. This is the first one to be tested since 1969 in the US. Yeah. So it's really taking older technology and bringing it back to life.
Right. I think the other interesting aspect of this, these are small modular reactors, which means you can produce them and dish them out through a conveyor belt. You can mass produce them. Yes. Actually.
That's the plan.
Very quickly.
That's the plan. That's why you'll see some capital flowing into these in a few minutes here. So what you have seen, to pick up your point, already countries have picked up the upside to this. So Russia and China, as I said before, have nuclear subs and icebreakers. This summer, both Japan and Korea approved MSR in concept earlier this year. The governments, yes. Korea has done in conjunction with the Nuclear Energy Department, I think, and one of the big shipbuilders. I've listened to former executives, both from IMO and from the Lloyd's Register, in terms of social acceptability, who don't have any, if you will, deep reservations at this point in time. I listened to a ship owners conference at the end of March, where the audience, only 11% rejected that. So that's a pretty strong acceptance rate of all the ship owners in the room at the time, which were numerous. The timetable being talked about here is testing by 23, commercialization by 2028. And what does that mean, and how does that work its way through a system? There are actually now two. I found a second one here, thanks to your friends in BRIX. The first of these is a group called Core Power UK. It's an existing company. Its first fundraising was in Singapore in 2019. And in 2020, they partnered with a company called Southern Company in the US. Part of the US, works closely with the US government, and Terra Power, which is chaired by Bill Gates, as well as Aramco, which is a French nuclear company. They've raised two series of capital A and B. Both of those were well funded, and their investors now include Burge Bulk and Express Feeders. These are leading shipping companies out of Singapore. So they have the capital. They're working on the technology, commercializing the technology. They already have major investors that are major shipping companies. That's this one. There's a second company in Denmark called Seaborg, which is being funded by a billionaire out of Denmark currently. Same concept, same timelines of 23 to 25, and ultimately be functional by the end of the decade. What does that mean? Enormous. This is a step change. So there are currently 60,000 container ships. 7,000 of those largest producing 50% of the emissions. So that's extraordinary. And so once, as you said, Hussein, once this gets these ships get built and kitted out properly, there's no need for refueling in the time of the ownership of the ship for years. It increases the speeds. It increases the internal storage capacity without the big fuel oil burns. Yes. It will currently canals such as Suez and Panama will require special considerations because, for obvious reasons, people say, "My gosh, nuclear, even if it's thorium, it's still people don't want action issues in those canals." It will also take substantial staff training to train them all to work with this new technology. But we've raised this point with over 1,000 attendees in Iceland. We had 15 attendees from China and over 50 countries. And we raised it a number of attendees from China. Everyone there is focused on how this can be brought to commercialization as soon as possible, but certainly by 2030. So in essence, what you have, if you will, I think this really completes it. Thank you. What you have on these three forms of transportation are: one, a transitional fuel, which produces a lot less CO2.
You can stop the sharing. Okay, I can stop it. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I did stop the sharing.
Yes, we're still recording though, or?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you. So I say from a summation point of view, one, the Arctic LNG is on course to hit 80, if not more, million tons a year to help drive the energy needs of China, India, and many countries in the East, as well as joining partners from the South at a lower form of CO2 emissions. Number two, we're heading more and more towards high-speed rail across Eurasia and across Southeast Asia, probably Southeast Asia before all of Eurasia, but by 2030, there should be high-speed rail across both of these areas, electric high-speed rail, which will help lower pressure on shipping. And finally, I'm pretty certain that somebody is going to find some way to commercialize this as soon as possible, because we also have an advisory hat on our firm, and I can assure you there's lots of interest in this technology from investors.
Sure.
So it's so while this didn't get explained at COP26, at least John Kerry did say roughly 50% of the changes to the world addressing climate change will come from technology. And here you see it's already happening. And the US is clearly aware. I'm pretty sure Mr. Gates was here talking to our Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, 2 weeks ago about some of these technologies.
Right.
So it's being actively pursued by many countries, despite it not being discussed at COP26.
Yeah, that's one of the issues, because they were focused on the negatives rather than the positives. I think during the COP26, there was a special session on nuclear technology, and there is now a nuclear renaissance, one can say. There are many countries now, there's called the Nuclear Club, who want to develop the nuclear technology jointly to be able to use that as a new source of energy. I mean, it is used. I mean, in France, you have 60–70% of the power is nuclear.
It's not new.
Here in Sweden,
it's not new. It was 1960.
No,
it had a plant in 1969.
But here in Sweden, we have 40–45% of the power is generated from nuclear power. But we had like 30 years of a dark age concerning nuclear technology and research and development. Now there are calls to reverse that, and we have actually in the Swedish Royal Technical School There's a very interesting research on these small modular reactors and all kinds of technology. So that's a positive way of dealing with the issue. But the whole Belt and Road, as you have explained, is going to see this massive shift into new fuels, into new modes of transportation. When the high-speed rail gets into the shipping sector, then it becomes, the whole maritime shipping industry will be challenged. So there are many positive ways of dealing with these kinds of problems, but the important thing is that you don't do it at the expense of the living standards, of the poverty elimination, of getting nations out of all these kinds of lack of electricity, lack of water, lack of food, and all these things. So that's, I think, what the Chinese are adamant on presenting the whole time. And when they don't see an opportunity to discuss this, like in the COP26, they will not come. And therefore, they have chosen to speak in other forums, as I said about President Xi Jinping, talking very freely to the ASEAN countries, rather than coming to Glasgow and where people will just say, no, just show us how many coal power plants are you going to shut to show that you are serious. And they say, no, this is not how we deal with these things.
But I don't think it's just China. I think if I've tried to show in this presentation, there's loads of countries behind all these initiatives.
Yeah.
It's a lot of collaboration, actually.
Yeah. And also, you have all the oil and gas producing countries, which they see themselves as villains now in the international community. They also have their own interests. They have their own legitimate rights. Like the president of Nigeria said, if you stop financing oil exploration, our nation, 200 plus million people, we will be starving. And therefore, it's not advised. My philosophy is that oil should not be used as fuel. It should be used as an industrial feedstock in plastics, cosmetics, chemicals, paints. You can do lots of things with oil rather than burning it. But so far, we are still dependent on this. And many nations, especially in developing sectors, they are very dependent on these kinds of fuels. And if you offer them a better alternative, of course, they will take it. But that's what is not happening. They are not being offered, especially by the West, any alternatives, building railways, building other means of transport. China is doing that, but China is not enough. We have to have the whole developed sector helping in that sense. Anyway, Henry, I think you explained these matters very well, where the future lies in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, but we will come back to this matter of the Chinese philosophy of what they call the green transition and the new development philosophy, because it's very important to understand the thinking of the Chinese rather than just rejecting everything and saying, no, this is all very bad, and you don't really know what's going on in there. So anyway, for our webinar, we will have the link below the video from our webinar last week on the Green Belt and Road, and we will provide you with more information. Thank you very much, Henry, for being with us today. It was quite enriching.
Great. Well, it's always great to work with you, Hussein, and the BRICS team. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and see you in the next podcast.
You bet. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.